Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 11 of Chess Basics, things every chess player ought to know. Last time I promised I would cover the case of two pawns versus one pawn in this video, but I realized since then, as I was thinking about it, that I hadn't covered the case of one pawn versus one pawn. And there's actually quite a lot to talk about here, including the famous bishop pawn versus queen draw and the trebuchet, which we will get to later in the program. Let's start out. When you have one pawn each, the most double-edged positions are when the pawns are far apart, and this is because the kings are sort of drawn in two directions. They want to defend, they want to stop the other pawn from queening, and at the same time they want to support their own pawn so that it can queen. So they've got to make a choice. They can't do both when the pawns are widely separated like this. So if white were to choose to go after black's pawn, this game would be a draw, because they're both just close enough to be inside the square of the pawn on their move. So if white wants to try for a win, and actually this is a position where he can try for a win, he has to enter into the pawn race. And pawn races are fairly easy to calculate, but you just have to watch out for a few special conditions. So like this pawn race looks even because both sides have three squares to cover. But white has a slight advantage in that he gets to move first. And this is one of those positions where that advantage turns out to be winning. And the reason is that when white queens, the queen of this rook pawn covers the queening square of the other rook pawn. So this pawn doesn't get to go anywhere. And if black brings his king up to try and defend, the queen just goes in front of the pawn, and he's just not there in time. So that's one trick you have to watch out for. Another one, which I'll show you. Here, let's set up another position. Again, it's white to move, and now this is undoubtedly a race. There's neither king can defend, get back and attack the other pawn. They're both too far away, and then white's king is blocked by black's king from getting to this pawn. So neither king can attack the other guy's pawn, so it's a straight race. And it also looks like it should be pretty even, but what happens here is that white queens with check, and that gives him an extra tempo. Now black would like to just queen his pawn on this move, and if he could have done that, then this would have been even. But he's forced to move his king, and now white can win this. And also the winning technique is pretty instructive. So if you've got a queen and it's your turn to move, and black's pawn is not yet a queen, you can usually win. There are a few cases depending on the exact position of things, like if well, we will cover some of those exceptions in the next one, but we'll show the normal winning case here. So first, the idea of winning is to drive black's king in front of the pawn. The reason you have to do that is because you really need your king to help out in order to win this game. And you can't just move your king at any particular time you feel like it, because black is maintaining this threat of queening, and that becomes a draw. So you have to creep in with your queen like this, checking and attacking the pawn till you get to this position. And now the only place that black can move that defends the pawn is to go to this square. And now you check here from directly across from the king. And this forces the king to make a decision. If he moves away, you grab the pawn. So he has to move in front of it if he wants to hold on, and now it's safe for your king to move in because the king is blocking the progress of his pawn. Okay, black's move, and he has two choices. He can go to this square or this square. Say he goes to the corner, you have a simple strategy of just checking along this file, driving him back in front of the pawn, bringing the king in. And now, well, one thing to watch out about, you don't want to move to this square because that would be a stalemate. You always want to be sure as you approach that you allow an escape square for your opponent's king. So you glide in along the third rank here, and he has an escape square here. So when the king goes to this position, you can pin the pawn along this diagonal. And once again, the black king has a choice of going right or left. The pawn can't move because of the pin. And the king moves away. You take the pawn, so he comes over here to hold on to it. But that's just a momentary thing because it's just a checkmate. And so let's go back to the position where black had a choice. It was here. So the other place he could have gone to is the h2 square. You can just go directly opposite the king in that case and pin along this file rank. Pin along that row. So now if the king moves back, you put your queen in front of the pawn, which is really an ideal situation for the queen. And then at your leisure, you can bring your king up and win that pawn. So for black to try to hold on, he's got to move his king into the corner. And once again, you can check along this file, drive him in front, and bring your king up. And you win the same way. You pin along this diagonal. He's got to move back to defend it. You attack the pawn with your king and queen, and he can no longer defend it. And he's even getting checkmated. So that's how you win these games. You need to win the race or have some trick like a checking, queening with check. And then if you get a queen move in before black has a chance to queen his pawn, then you can often win the game. Let's show one other example of how you can win. So let's move the pawns a little bit closer, and we'll put black's king in an awkward spot. And so the race goes as before. Both sides get to queen in this case, and the special trick you will see shortly has to do with the awkward position of black's king. What you can do in a case like this is you can come over and check the king, and he can't stay on this file. He has to go to the neighboring file. And he can't go to this square because the queen covers it, so he's really got to go to one of those two squares. And whichever square he chooses, you can check here, the king moves away, and you grab the queen. So that's called a skewer. You skewer the king, force him out of the way, and pick up the queen. So when you're calculating these races, those are the things you have to look for. You just count the number of squares to see who's queening first. And if you queen soon enough, you can just win. If you're say a couple moves ahead of your opponent. If you queen just one move ahead, you may still be able to win if you can queen with check, or if you can get a skewer on your first move. And that pretty much takes care of the widely separated cases. Now let's go on to that famous case I mentioned before of the bishop-pawn draw. We're going to move black's pawn back. We're going to put black's king in a good square. And it's still going to be white's turn to move. So in this position, everything looks good for white. It's his turn to move, and he's one square closer. So he's going to queen with plenty of time to stop that pawn from queening. So why is this a draw? Why is this the famous bishop pawn draw? So you get a queen, and he gets a pawn to the 7th rank. And so you try to use the same technique as before, right? You check the king, you attack the pawn, you just creep in, as we did the last time. Should be a win, right? Well, everything goes fine, right up until the critical position here. And the black king has to move right or left. And what he does in this case is he surprises you by moving away from the pawn. And now you realize to your horror that if you take that pawn, it's a stalemate because the queen covers all of these squares and the black king has no moves. So that's a stalemate. So you can't take the pawn here. And that's why this position is a draw. If you can't take the pawn, what else are you going to do? So check, he moves. You can't bring your king in because his pawn will queen. All you can do is deliver more checks. But there's no progress there. Eventually you have to give up and take the pawn. And that's a stalemate. So that's why the bishop pawn case, if he can get to the 7th rank, it doesn't matter if you get the queen. when he gets to the 7th rank, even though he can't actually create a queen himself, unless you do something wrong, but you can't ever take the pawn either, so that's a draw. Okay, that's enough for the widely separated pawns. Let's look at the cases where the pawns are closer together. So when the pawns are closer together, the position gets more drawish. Let's give an example where the pawns are on adjacent files. The reason it's a little more drawish is because the kings are in position to both attack and defend. And we'll see an example of that here. And also when they're in adjacent files like this, you'll see the pawns block each other's progress. So it's white's turn to move. He can step forward. Black can step forward. And then he's kind of stuck. He has to step back because black is covering all of these squares. Or he could try pushing his pawn forward. Black could just take it. And you know from the videos I did on king and pawn versus king, this is actually just a draw. So even though you've given up a pawn, it's still a draw. So, you know, you can push ahead and give it a draw. Let's say black can try pushing his pawn. And then you end up losing a pawn because you don't have too many good squares to go to. You just fall back, his king takes the pawn, and then you step in front of the pawn, and once again you've got one of these drawing positions that we looked at early in this video series. So those turn out to be draws. Let's give one other example. Let's see. I need to waste a few moves just to set up the position I want to get to. Yeah, so white has gotten to the most aggressive position he can get to. He's protecting his pawn, he's attacking black's pawn, and black's king is a little bit out of play, but it is still putting pressure on this pawn. And even this one is a draw, and the problem is that you can take black's pawn, but when you do, he takes your pawn. So this is a good position to know. It sometimes occurs fairly often in practice, and it's still a draw. It looks like, you know, white's making progress, but it's an illusion. So all those turn out to be draws, and then the last case we want to look at is the trebuchet. So the trebuchet is a medieval instrument, a medieval catapult, and we'll see how that's appropriate in a second. So let's put the kings back, put the pawns back, and have the pawns butting heads with each other like that, and it's white's turn to move. Okay, so this is a draw. White could try to get in, but black can always block his progress. So, but what if the kings are in a different position and they're on the opposite sides of the pawns? And this is the trebuchet, when you get in a position like this. And this can happen when, for example, the kings were engaged in other activities and then they're just coming back from whatever they're doing to meet these pawns. So the kings are a little bit reversed from their usual position. Usually you're behind your pawn. So, but if this is a case where you've gotten in front of your pawn. And there's an interesting technique here. White can actually win this position. So in contrast to all these other drawing positions, and the reason is he can set up a trebuchet. So the way he sets that up is he goes to this square here, which attacks white's pawn, black's pawn. He's attacking that pawn. And it's important to note that white's pawn is guarding these squares, so black only has one square he can go to that defends his pawn. He has to go to this square. And now white has this move where he slides back, defends his pawn, and continues to attack black's pawn. And where can black go? First of all, that square is guarded, so his only squares he can go to are these. And when he steps to any of these squares, white can take that pawn and then go on to win, because his king being in front of the pawn is in excellent position to help that queen. So this here is the trebuchet, and I guess the idea is that black's king is flung off of the trebuchet. He's catapulted away from the pawns. So this is a tricky position. It's important to do this in the right order. If you immediately go to this square, attacking black's pawn, seems logical, then black can throw you off the trebuchet by going to this square, defending his pawn, attacking your pawn, and now you're the one that has to move, and black's pawn is guarding that square, so your only moves are away from the pawn, and black goes on to win. So whoever steps on the trebuchet last is the winner, or whoever steps on it first is the loser. So the way you force your opponent onto the trebuchet is to attack the pawn from this square where you're not on the trebuchet. You force him onto it, and then you take up your position and fling him off and then grab his pawn. So that's it for this episode of Chess Basics. Hope you enjoyed that, and next time we will get on to the case of 2 pawns versus 1 pawn. See you then. Bye.